So this presentation is going to go over chapter 4, which is all about interpersonal perception. And what we're talking about with perception is literally how we perceive things and how we come to understand things when people are interacting with us and what influences our perception, and how we come to negotiate things within interpersonal communication contexts. I want to apologize if you hear some ducks quacking in the background. I'm at a park right now and I'm slowly being attacked by ducks, so hopefully they'll calm down a little bit and we'll be all right. You'll be able to hear me talk throughout this presentation. So what we're going to look at is the process of perception, some fundamental forces in interpersonal perception, explaining what we perceive, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how you can improve your perceptual abilities. So to start things off, the process of perception, interpersonal perception is the process of making meaning from the people in our environment and our relationships with them. So that's our definition of interpersonal perception. And it's really getting at how when we see something or we hear something or we interact with somebody, how do we make meaning? How do we say, oh, this is what that means, or oh, this is what that process means, or oh, this is what that action that person has taken, that's what it means within our environment and our relationships within them. So we got to look at it in kind of two ways. With interpersonal communication, clearly we'll always be focusing on the relationship we have with the individuals that we're communicating with. So that's always a big factor. You know, is this an interaction you're having with a stranger, or is it somebody that's close to you, like a sibling or a spouse or a best friend? And then what's the environment in which that situation or that interaction is taking place? Are there other people around? Is it a negative thing that has taken place? Is it a positive thing that has taken place? Just how does the environment influence our perception? And then the relationships that we have with the individuals in which that conversation or that interpersonal interaction is taking place. How do those two things come together and inform how we actually make meaning of the situation, the interpersonal context in which we're in? And there's a process. Basically, it's selection, organization, and interpretation. So selection, as we all can kind of agree with, we're always in contexts where we're not paying attention to every single thing. I'm sitting in a park right now at a bench, and I mentioned the ducks. I got some water going by me, but I'm not paying attention to every single tree. I'm focusing on giving this lecture, so there may be people walking by, and I'm not paying attention to that. You know, there's vehicles moving around me. There's a lot of stuff happening, but I'm being very selective on what I'm paying attention to. Mainly my focus is on, delivering this presentation. So whenever you're in any kind of situation or interpersonal context, there's only so much that we can pay attention to. We cannot completely capture every single thing happening in any given context, so we kind of prioritize and pay attention to certain things. And so that selection is the first step of the process of perception. Next, when we choose certain things to pay attention to, we start to organize it and put it into categories. We classify what's stimulating us and what we're perceiving and what we're coming to understand. We package it in a way so that we can then next interpret it. We assign meaning to it. So we select what we're seeing in any interpersonal situation. We then try to organize it and put it into compartments so it's easier for us to manage. And then once we have those compartments figured out, we ascribe meaning to it. We interpret it. We actually put meaning to what it is that we're seeing. So if we're in a situation where we're interacting with somebody, we first pay attention to particular things, maybe particular behaviors that they're, engaging in. Maybe their eye contact, they're not looking at you directly, or maybe they're hesitating a lot in their talk, maybe they're asking a lot of questions. We pay attention to that, and then we kind of organize those things and put them into groups, and then we try to interpret it. Okay, if this person's not making a lot of eye contact with me on these various topics, maybe then they're not being completely honest. That's the interpretation. That's the meaning that we would ascribe to that. So know the process of perception, selection, organization, and interpretation. And then there's a lot of factors that affect selection, what it is that we pay attention to. Usually things that are unusual or unexpected, we pay attention to. We notice things that are out of the ordinary. We pay attention to things that don't follow the script in which we feel it should follow. If we're in a situation, and say you're at like a meeting at a company or something like that, or you're at a company picnic or a celebration or an award ceremony or something like that, and one of the organizational leaders is up in front on a podium talking with people, a person to jump up in the middle of a presentation and say something very rude, we're going to select that. We're going to pay attention to that. Whereas there might be some small talk or some other things happening, or even when the speaker themselves is talking, we might not pay attention as much because that's kind of normal and how things are supposed to go. But if you have a random person get up in the middle of the audience and scream some obscenities or something like that, we're going to notice that. We're going to select that. Another factor is frequency. So if we're exposed to something over and over and over again, we tend to pay more attention to it. And then the intensity of the stimulus. So again, if you go back to that room where somebody's giving a presentation and an audience member comes up and screams something very vulgar, that's very intense. Whereas if somebody's saying something, a little more generous or complimentary or something like that, that's not necessarily intense. It's still unusual, so we're going to see it, but it's not as intense. It's not as crazy. So, if we're driving down the road and all of a sudden a car accident happens, that's an intense stimulus, whereas all the cars driving down the road, that's pretty normal. It's not as intense. We're not going to pay attention to every single vehicle driving down the road, but for that one car that flips over at the stop sign or rolls into the ditch, we're going to notice that. We're going to pay a lot of attention to that. There's different types of organizations. So now moving into the organization side of things, there's physical constructs, there's physical views and perceptions that we're used to, and we come to see things physically in certain ways. We have role constructs, meaning what roles individuals play within any given context. If you're at a family dinner or something like that, and maybe your grandpa's the wise one, we're kind of going to listen to him when it's time to talk about wise things or provide information or when offering suggestions, compared to your cousin that's been in trouble with the law 3 or 4 times. You're probably not going to take as much advice from him because there's a role construct at play there. You kind of already know what these two people are all about and what they have to offer. There's interaction constructs, there's rules about how we should interact, and that influences us. So if you're speaking with somebody that's got more power than you, like your CEO or your boss or a professor or anything like that, your manager, there's kind of a construct for how you should interact with them compared to if you're interacting with one of your best friends outside of school or outside of work. And then there's psychological constructs, basically the way there's constructs about the ways that we think and about the ways that people think and interact and respond to things. And then there's also influences on our interpretation. So our experience with the other person's a huge one. If you have a friend that has continually let you down in a certain way, you're going to start to just be like, yep, well, I've kind of expected this. That's how it is. If it's a person that's always been loyal and faithful to you, however, and they do something to disrespect you or, go against you, that's going to have a huge influence over our interpretation of that. Instead of the friend that continually does it, we're going to be like, yeah, whatever, this happens. It might affect us and impact us more, and we might ascribe a lot more meaning to it if it's somebody that's always been good to us, but then out of nowhere does something. The knowledge of him or her, what we know about their background is going to influence, and also the closeness of our relationship with him or her. So relationship plays a huge role in how we ascribe meaning and interpret interpersonal communication contexts. There's several influences that affect our accuracy. So we're not always 100% accurate with our perceptions of things, and this is how arguments and misunderstandings and miscommunications and hurt feelings and all that kind of stuff takes place. There's physiological states and traits. There's certain traits and just behaviors and characteristics that are inherent to each of us, and those play a huge role in how we perceive interaction. Culture and cult culture. What are the cultural backgrounds and the cult cultures in which individuals belong to? Not only who others belong to, but what you belong to, and what are the rules and the values and the norms of the cultures you belong to. And then the social roles. What is it that society is socially constructing and saying this is how you're supposed to behave? In situations, males are supposed to act certain ways, females are supposed to act certain ways, younger people are supposed to act certain ways, older people are supposed to act certain ways in given situations. So we use all these different types of things, and they ultimately impact how accurate our interpersonal perceptions are. Often if we're interacting with somebody of a different culture, there's kind of a way or a role or a construct for how you believe that interaction should take place in any given moment, but it could be very different for somebody from a different culture. And that oftentimes influences and screws up how accurate we are with our perceptions. So some of these forces include stereotypes. Stereotyping is a big one that often leads to an accuracy problem. We're often inaccurate due to our stereotypes. Sometimes we are accurate because of our stereotypes. But this is when it's a three-step process. First, we identify a group we believe someone belongs to. So we see somebody and just judge based on their physical appearance or something that they're wearing or the way that they're acting. We kind of start to throw them into groups and start to categorize them to try to make sense of how we should interact with them. Then we recall a generalization about that group that we put them in. We try to think of something that is associated with that group or a characteristic or a quality of that group, and then we apply that generalization to the person. Sometimes this works, sometimes we're accurate with this, sometimes we can be very, very wrong when it comes to this. So it's important that you recognize your stereotypes and how they influence interpersonal perception. There's also the primacy and recency effect, and kind of what this is getting at, the things that happen in the beginning and the things that happen in the end are the most powerful. So the primacy effect says our first impression of someone overshadows our later impressions of that person. So basically that first image, that first impression that we get of somebody, it tends to stick with us. It tends to influence our future interactions with that person and our future views of that person. The recency effect goes on the opposite end and basically says the most recent impression we have of somebody or the most recent interaction that we have with an individual is going to overshadow and be more powerful than earlier impressions. So what this is kind of saying is the very first impression we get and the last one that we have are usually the two that have the most impact and the most power over the way we perceive people and perceive our communication with them in any kind of given interpersonal interaction or interpersonal context. We also have a perceptual set. It's a predisposition to perceive only what we want to or expect to perceive. So we all kind of have pre-organized ways and preset perceptual sets that we've developed over time. And when we develop these, it's kind of what we're looking for. It's almost like paying attention to what we want to pay attention to, paying attention to what we are expecting to pay attention to, and kind of notice the things that we expect to see in any given interaction. And egocentrism is something to be very careful about. This is the inability to take another person's perspective. Basically what this is saying is the way I do it, the way I see it, the way I've always done it, the way my culture says it exists, that's the right way to do it, and the way you're doing it is wrong. When it's not really a matter of right or wrong, it's just different. People do different things. They perceive things differently. They see things differently. They interact differently. They behave differently. And sometimes these things don't align from culture to culture or group to group or person to person. So it's important that we recognize and try to understand when interacting with other people, just because they're not quote unquote, doing it the way I would or communicating the way I would, there's probably a reason they're communicating and interacting with me the way they are, and I should try to understand why that is so I can be more cognitively complex when interacting with them. We have a positivity bias. This causes us to perceive information in an overly idealistic way. Sometimes when it's something that already aligns with us or our beliefs, we tend to view it much more positively or optimistically than it is. But then on the opposite, this is the negativity bias is where we view information in an overly pessimistic way. I'll just kind of use a pretty general example. If you're a Democrat, you're going to have a positivity bias towards Democratic leaders when they're giving their political speeches and giving their campaign trails. You're going to see the things that those folks are saying as much more positive than it might actually be. Whereas if you're a Democrat and you're listening to a Republican candidate speak or a Republican candidate at a campaign trail talk or anything like that, you might view those things as much more negative than they actually are. So again, what we typically agree with and what we usually like or aligns with our values, we see as more positively, whereas if it's something we disagree with or it doesn't align with our ways of thinking, we're going to see that as a much more negative thing. We're going to have a much more negative bias towards it. When we perceive things, we also give attributions. These are the explanations we give for our own and other people's behaviors. So after things happen, this is kind of how we reflect on it and make sense of it and attribute to some kind of force for why it happened. So there's three main things that we use when we're making attributions. There's locus, stability, and controllability. And what locus gets at is essentially who's in control and what's in control of the situation. Is this something that the individual did purposefully, or is there some kind of external factor that influenced their action. So is it more of this individual purposefully said this mean thing, or purposefully did this action in a malicious way, or did this purposefully in a positive way, or was it like there were some external factors at play, and that's kind of what really influenced the individual to act the way that they did. Stability refers to how stable that attribute is. Is it something that's just always going to be with that person, or is it something that can change? And then controllability is how much control the person actually has over the attribution. How much can the person in that interaction actually control these things that are influencing us? We also have a self-serving bias. This influences the accuracy of our attributions as well. We tend to view the things that we do positively as something we've done. Our successes we see as earned and deserved, and I did that, and I made that happen for myself, and it wouldn't have happened if I didn't have the gumption to really take on these things. But we often blame our failures on external forces. Oh, the weather wasn't good that day, or oh, well, my family was going through a rough time, so that's the reason why. So that's what self-serving bias is all about. The good things that we accomplish, we tend to view as something that we've done and that we've earned, whereas when negative things happen, we sometimes blame them on external factors. There's also the fundamental attribution error, and this is, again, similar. This is where we blame other people's behaviors for internal stable causes, but we sometimes view our own actions and behaviors as due to external causes. So we often, a lot of things are happening in a lot of people's lives. And we tend to focus on others and blame it for internal, individual reasons that they have complete control over, instead of looking at all the environmental factors that might play into why this type of behavior exists, or why they're acting this way, or why they're talking this way, so on and so forth. There's over-attribution. This influences our accuracy as well. We tend, sometimes with an individual, we'll identify one prominent characteristic, like that person's assertive, or that person's really nice, or that person's really generous, or that person's really funny. And then we'll kind of just attribute most of what they say to that characteristic. So if somebody's funny, regardless of the context, or regardless of the interaction, or regardless of the group, we'll typically just say, oh, they're a funny person, or they're acting funny, or we'll just kind of have in our background, they're a funny individual, and that's why they're acting this way. And often that's damaging, because there's a lot of different characteristics people have, and we should pay attention to more than just one, and not let that one perceive or lead our perception of that individual and the interactions we're having with them. So how can we improve? How can we improve our perceptual abilities? Be mindful. Be aware of your biases. Try to catch yourself when you're talking to yourself, in your mind, or when you're in interactions. Try to be aware of the biases and the stereotypes you're having. Try to focus more on other people's characteristics. Try to focus on what they are all about, what their traits are, what their characteristics are, and always be considerate of the context in which interaction is happening. If it's a casual setting at like a bar or out at a restaurant or something like that, that context is going to be much more different than like a meeting at work, where there's a little bit more formality and things like that. So know your biases, focus on the other's characteristics, and consider the communication context. Check your perceptions. Always try to separate your interpretations from facts. All right, so always look up the objective facts that can be brought to the table. Try to generate alternative perceptions. We'll always arrive at one primary perception, but try to think of alternatives that might be at play to try to change your thinking. Engage in perception checking. Again, this is where you check your perception, and then always revise your perceptions as needed. Once you kind of realize that you're inaccurate, or you need to change it, or you need to change the game a little bit. All right, that does it for interpersonal perception. I will talk to you in the future.